The security guard at my apartment complex wouldn't even look me in the eye as he handed me the eviction notice. 3 days. That's all I had to pack up what was left of my life and get out. My own family had called the landlord, told him I was a deadbeat who couldn't pay rent, a grown man living off charity and false promises. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating. I stood there in the lobby holding that piece of paper, watching the guard shuffle back to his post like he'd just delivered someone's death sentence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In a way, he had. Not my death, but the death of any illusion I had left about the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. My phone buzzed, a text from my sister Jessica. Sorry it had to come to this, Marcus, you brought this on yourself. Maybe now you'll finally grow up and get a real job instead of chasing fantasies. Fantasies. If she only knew. The morning started like any other Wednesday. I woke up at 5:30, same as always, in the cramped studio apartment I'd been renting in downtown Phoenix for the past 2 years. The place wasn't much to look at. Water stains on the ceiling, carpet that had seen better decades, and a kitchen so small you could touch both walls if you stretched your arms out. But it was mine, or at least it had been until my family decided to play God with my life. I'd moved to Phoenix after things fell apart in Denver. That's where I grew up, where my whole family still lived, clustered together in the same suburban neighborhood like they were afraid of what might happen if they ventured more than 10 miles from each other. My mother Patricia lived in the house I grew up in, the one with the white picket fence and the rose garden she'd tended for 30 years. My older brother David lived 3 streets over with his wife and twin boys. Jessica, my younger sister, had the apartment above Mom's garage, rent-free of course because she was finding herself as a freelance graphic designer. Then there was me, the black sheep. The disappointment, the one who'd left home at 22 with big dreams and bigger ambitions, only to come crawling back 2 years later with nothing to show for it but debt and broken promises. At least that's what they thought. I'd been working 3 jobs in Denver trying to make ends meet while I built something they couldn't see, wouldn't understand, and definitely didn't believe in. During the day, I waited tables at a family restaurant called Murphy's, serving coffee and pancakes to truckers and office workers who barely acknowledged my existence. 3 nights a week I cleaned offices downtown, emptying trash cans and vacuuming carpets in buildings where people in expensive suits made more money in a day than I made in a month. And on weekends I drove for a rideshare company, ferrying drunk college students and airport travelers around the city. But none of that was my real work. My real work happened in the 4 hours between midnight and dawn, hunched over my laptop in that tiny apartment, building something that would either change everything or destroy what was left of my sanity. I'd always been good with computers, ever since I was a kid. While David was playing football and Jessica was learning piano, I was teaching myself to code, staying up all night building websites and games that nobody would ever see. My parents thought it was a waste of time. You can't make a living playing on computers, my father used to say before he passed away when I was 19. Get a trade, son, something real, but I kept at it. Through high school, through the 2 years of community college I could afford, through every dead-end job I worked to keep food on the table. I had an idea, a vision for something that could revolutionize how small businesses manage their customer relationships. Not another generic software package, but something intelligent, adaptive, something that could learn and grow with each business it served. The problem was, nobody wanted to hear it. I pitched my idea to dozens of investors in Denver. I filled out applications for business loans, startup accelerators, angel investor groups. The responses were always the same. I was too young, too inexperienced, too unknown. I didn't have the right connections, the right background, the right pedigree. One investor actually told me to come back when you have some real business experience. That's when the money started running out. The apartment became too expensive, the car payments fell behind. The credit card bills piled up like autumn leaves. I swallowed my pride and called home. Mom, I said, I need help. The conversation that followed was one I'd replayed in my head 1,000 times since. She listened as I explained my situation, my vision, my belief that I was on the verge of something incredible. When I finished, there was a long pause. Marcus, she said finally, you're 24 years old. It's time to stop playing games and start taking responsibility for your life. Come home. David knows a guy who can get you work at the construction company. Steady pay, good benefits, a chance to learn a real skill. But Mom, you don't understand. This software I'm building, it could. Could what? Make you rich? Make you famous? Sweetheart, the world is full of people with big dreams and empty bank accounts. I won't watch you become one of them. So I went home, tail between my legs, dreams carefully packed away in boxes I swore I'd never open again. I moved back into my childhood bedroom with its faded superhero posters and participation trophies from Little League. David got me the job at Morrison Construction, where I spent my days carrying lumber, mixing concrete, and listening to guys 20 years older than me complain about their ex-wives and their gambling debts. For 6 months I tried to convince myself this was enough. I was making money, helping my mother with her expenses, rebuilding my credit score one payment at a time. I even went on a few dates with Sarah, a nurse who worked at the hospital where Jessica had her appendix removed. Everyone seemed pleased with my progress. Look at Marcus, finally getting his act together, finally growing up. But late at night, when the house was quiet and my body ached from another day of manual labor, I'd pull out my laptop and keep working. I couldn't help myself. The code called to me like a siren song, promising solutions to problems I saw everywhere I looked. At the construction site, I watched the office managers struggle with scheduling and billing. At the grocery store, I saw cashiers wrestling with inventory systems that belonged in the Stone Age. At the DMV, I witnessed bureaucratic inefficiency that would have been comedic if it wasn't so frustrating for everyone involved. The software was getting better, more sophisticated, more powerful. I started testing it with a few small businesses around Denver, offering it for free in exchange for feedback. A coffee shop owner named Elena was my first real user. She'd been tracking customer preferences on index cards stuffed into a shoebox. Within a week of implementing my system, she was sending personalized offers to her regulars and had increased her repeat business by 30%. That's when I started thinking bigger. I began reaching out to businesses beyond Denver. Small restaurants in Portland, boutique clothing stores in Austin, auto repair shops in Milwaukee. Word spread slowly but steadily. My nights became consumed with customer support calls, feature requests, and debugging sessions that stretched until sunrise. I was running on caffeine and adrenaline, sustained by the growing realization that I'd built something valuable, something that could actually make a difference. The problem was keeping it secret. David would drop by unannounced, expecting to find me watching TV or sleeping off another day of honest work. Jessica had a key to the house and treated it like her personal hangout space, complete with friends who thought my dedication to my laptop was either adorable or pathetic depending on their mood. And Mom, she had this way of appearing in doorways at the exact moment you least wanted to see her, armed with questions and observations that could cut through any lie you might be constructing. "You look tired, honey," she'd say, studying my face like she was reading tea leaves. "Are you taking care of yourself?" "Just stayed up too late watching Netflix," I'd lie, closing the laptop as casually as possible. "Maybe you should spend less time with those silly shows and more time thinking about your future." "Sarah asked David about you yesterday. She's a good girl, Marcus. Don't let her slip away because you're too busy living in a fantasy world." Sarah, sweet practical Sarah, who believed a good life consisted of a steady job, a nice house, and 2 weeks of vacation every summer. She'd been hinting about moving in together, about making things official. When she looked at me, she saw potential husband material, someone reliable and predictable, someone who would come home every night with dirty hands and a steady paycheck. She had no idea that the man she was falling for was living a double life. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday in March. I was working the late shift at Murphy's, refilling coffee cups and pretending to listen to a regular customer complain about his mother-in-law, when my phone started buzzing with notifications. Messages from Elena, from the boutique owner in Austin, from the auto shop in Milwaukee. They were all saying the same thing. Other business owners were calling them, asking about the software I'd built. Word was spreading through industry networks, professional associations, social media groups I'd never heard of. By the time I got home, I had 17 inquiries from potential customers. By the end of the week I had 43. By the end of the month I had over 200 businesses wanting to know more about this mysterious customer management system that was supposedly revolutionizing how small companies operated. That's when I realized I had a choice to make. I could keep pretending to be the reformed dreamer who'd finally accepted reality, or I could take the biggest risk of my life and bet everything on the thing I'd been building in secret. I chose the risk. I started by incorporating properly. Marcus Chen Solutions, LLC. Not the most creative name, but it was mine, and it was real, and it was registered with the state of Colorado as a legitimate business entity. I opened a business bank account with the $500 I had in savings. I designed a website, created professional marketing materials, and established a customer support system that could handle the growing volume of inquiries. The hardest part was keeping up the charade at home. David would see me leaving for work every morning and assume I was heading to the construction site. In reality, I was driving to a 24-hour coffee shop downtown, where I'd set up a makeshift office in the back corner, surrounded by business plans, customer feedback forms, and empty espresso cups. The money started coming in slowly, then faster. $29 a month per customer for the basic package, $49 for premium, $79 for enterprise features. It didn't sound like much, but when you multiplied it by dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of customers, it began to add up. Within 3 months I was making more from the software than I was making from construction. Within 6 months I was making more than David made as a supervisor. But I couldn't tell them, not yet. I needed to be sure this was real, sustainable, not just a lucky streak that would evaporate the moment I admitted it existed. So I kept showing up at the construction site, kept playing the role of the reformed black sheep, kept letting them believe I'd finally learned to accept my limitations. The pretending became exhausting.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At family dinners, I'd sit quietly while David talked about his promotion and Jessica shared updates about her latest client project. They'd ask about my work with the kind of polite disinterest reserved for topics nobody really wants to discuss. How are things at Morrison? Mom would ask and I'd mumble something about a new project or a difficult supervisor, all while my phone buzzed with messages from customers who were seeing 30, 40, 50% improvements in their business metrics. The cognitive dissonance was brutal. During the day I was Marcus the laborer, the guy who carried other people's materials and followed other people's plans. But at night and on weekends I was Marcus the entrepreneur, the innovator, the CEO of a growing company that was transforming how small businesses operated across the country. The turning point came in August, almost a year after I'd moved back home. I was in the middle of a major system upgrade, working 16-hour days to implement new features that would allow businesses to integrate with social media platforms and e-commerce systems. The software was becoming more powerful, more comprehensive, more valuable, and the customers were noticing. That's when TechCrunch called. I was sitting in the coffee shop, debugging a particularly stubborn piece of code when my phone rang. Unknown number with a San Francisco area code. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another sales call or customer service inquiry, but something made me pick up. Is this Marcus Chen from Marcus Chen Solutions? The voice was professional, confident, distinctly Californian. Yes, this is Marcus. This is Rebecca Martinez from TechCrunch. I'm writing a story about innovative customer relationship management solutions for small businesses and your name keeps coming up in my research. I was wondering if you might have some time to chat about your company. I nearly dropped the phone. TechCrunch. The TechCrunch. The publication that could make or break a startup with a single article that had launched dozens of companies into the stratosphere with the right kind of coverage. Yes, I'd be happy to talk, I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. The interview lasted 2 hours. Rebecca asked about everything: my background, my inspiration for the software, my business model, my growth projections, my vision for the future. I found myself talking about features and capabilities I'd never discussed with anyone, sharing metrics and success stories I'd been keeping to myself, painting a picture of a company that was bigger, more sophisticated, and more successful than even I had realized. When the article came out 3 weeks later, everything changed. Denver startup quietly revolutionizes small business CRM, read the headline. Below it was a photo I'd taken hastily in the coffee shop, trying to look professional despite the industrial background noise and fluorescent lighting. The article described Marcus Chen Solutions as one of the most promising customer relationship management platforms to emerge from the Mountain West, highlighting customer testimonials and growth statistics that made my little operation sound like the next big thing in business software. Within hours of publication, my email inbox was flooded, not just with customer inquiries this time, but with messages from investors, potential partners, acquisition-hungry competitors, and journalists from other publications wanting to write their own stories about the mysterious young CEO who was disrupting a billion-dollar industry from a coffee shop in Denver. The phone calls were the hardest part. Venture capital firms from Silicon Valley, private equity groups from New York, tech companies from Seattle, all wanting to schedule meetings, explore opportunities, discuss funding rounds and strategic partnerships. I'd take these calls while sitting in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by superhero posters and high school trophies, trying to sound like the kind of serious business leader these people expected me to be. One call stood out above the rest. Jonathan Hartwell, managing partner at Pinnacle Ventures, one of the most respected investment firms in the country. He'd read the TechCrunch article and wanted to know if I was interested in raising capital for expansion.
Marcus, he said, we're seeing 30% month-over-month growth in your customer base, retention rates above 90%, and profit margins that most established software companies would kill for. This is exactly the kind of scalable, sustainable business model we look for. Would you be open to discussing a Series A funding round? Series A. I'd read about these in business magazines, these massive influxes of capital that transformed promising startups into industry giants. Companies that went through Series A funding rounds were serious, legitimate, real in a way that my late-night coding sessions and coffee shop meetings hadn't felt real. What kind of numbers are we talking about? I asked, trying to sound like I had these conversations every day. Based on your current metrics and growth trajectory, we'd be looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 12 million for a 20 to 25% equity stake. That would value your company at roughly $40 to $50 million. I had to repeat the numbers back to him to make sure I'd heard correctly. $40 to $50 million, for something I'd built in my spare time, something my family dismissed as a fantasy, something I was still hiding from the people who were supposed to know me best. The meeting was scheduled for the following month in their Denver office. Pinnacle maintained a regional presence there, Jonathan explained, specifically to identify promising startups in emerging markets. They'd done their preliminary due diligence based on publicly available information and customer feedback, but they'd need to conduct a thorough examination of my business operations, financial records, and growth projections before moving forward with any formal offer. That's when the panic set in. Due diligence meant they'd want to see everything. My office space, my equipment, my staff, my operational procedures. They'd want to meet with my team, review my hiring practices, understand my organizational structure. They'd expect to find a real company with real employees and real infrastructure, not a one-man operation running out of coffee shops and childhood bedrooms. I had 6 weeks to transform Marcus Chen Solutions from a well-kept secret into a legitimate business that could withstand the scrutiny of sophisticated investors. 6 weeks to create the kind of company I'd been pretending to run for the better part of a year. I started by finding office space, a small suite in a downtown Denver business complex, nothing fancy but professional enough to impress visitors who were used to dealing with serious entrepreneurs. I furnished it with second-hand equipment and hired my first employee, a recent computer science graduate named Kevin, who was brilliant with databases and didn't ask too many questions about why his new boss seemed to be learning the ropes of running a company at the same time he was building it. Next came the infrastructure. Professional phone systems, customer support protocols, accounting software that could handle the complexity of a growing business, legal documentation that would satisfy investor requirements. I worked 18-hour days for 5 straight weeks, transforming my hobby project into something that looked and felt like a real company. The hardest part was still the secrecy. My family knew I was spending more time away from home, but they assumed I was picking up extra shifts at the construction company, or maybe finally taking Sarah's hints about spending more serious time together. When they asked about my longer hours, I'd mumble something about overtime opportunities and storm damage that required weekend work. They seemed satisfied with these explanations, or at least uninterested enough not to probe deeper. David did notice the new clothes I'd bought for investor meetings. "Looking sharp, little brother," he said one evening when I came home in a business suit. "Job interview, something like that," I replied, which wasn't technically a lie. The meeting with Pinnacle Ventures went better than I could have imagined. Jonathan brought 2 associates and a technical consultant who spent 3 hours reviewing my software architecture, customer database, and financial projections. They asked tough questions about scalability, competition, and long-term strategic vision, but I'd spent weeks preparing for exactly these kinds of inquiries. By the end of the afternoon, they were talking about timeline and terms, as if the funding round was a foregone conclusion. "We'll need a few days to finalize our internal assessment," Jonathan said as we shook hands outside the office building, "but I can tell you we're very impressed with what you've built here. Expect to hear from us by Friday." Friday came and went without word. So did the following Monday and Tuesday. I spent the week checking my email every few minutes, refreshing my voicemail, wondering if I'd somehow blown the opportunity of a lifetime. Had they discovered something wrong with my business model? Had a competitor warned them away? Had they realized I was just a construction worker with delusions of grandeur? The call finally came on Wednesday evening. I was at Murphy's, working my regular shift, when my phone buzzed with Jonathan's number. I stepped into the kitchen to take the call, hoping the dishwasher noise wouldn't drown out whatever he had to say. Marcus, I apologize for the delay. We had to run your proposal through our full partnership review, which always takes longer than I'd like, but I'm calling with good news. Pinnacle would like to move forward with a formal offer. I gripped the phone tighter, not trusting myself to speak. We're prepared to invest $10 million for a 22% equity stake, which values your company at just over $45 million. The funding would be released in 2 tranches, with $7 million available immediately and the remaining $3 million contingent on hitting specific growth targets over the next 18 months. Does that sound like something you'd be interested in pursuing? $10 million, $45 million valuation. The numbers were so large they didn't feel real, like someone was describing the plot of a movie rather than offering to transform my life in ways I'd never imagined possible. Yes, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. That sounds very interesting. Excellent. I'll have our legal team prepare the term sheet and due diligence documentation. We'll need to formalize a few things on your end as well. Corporate structure, board composition, employee agreements, that sort of thing. Nothing complicated, but the kind of documentation required for an investment of this size. How does 2 weeks sound for getting everything in order? 2 weeks to finalize the transformation from fantasy to reality. 2 weeks to become the kind of serious business leader these people believed I already was. 2 weeks to stop pretending and start living the life I'd been building in secret. 2 weeks works perfectly, I said. That night, I sat in my childhood bed, staring at the superhero posters and participation trophies that had witnessed my journey from frustrated dreamer to legitimate entrepreneur. In 2 weeks I'd be signing documents that would change everything. I'd be accountable to investors, responsible to employees, committed to growth targets that would determine whether this incredible opportunity became a stepping stone to something even bigger or a cautionary tale about getting in over my head. But first I had to decide what to do about my family. How do you tell people who've spent months pitying your failures that you've secretly built a multi-million-dollar company? How do you explain that the person they thought they knew, the reformed black sheep who'd finally accepted his limitations, had never existed at all? I decided to wait until after the documents were signed, until the money was in the bank and the reality was undeniable. Until there was no way for them to dismiss what I'd accomplished as another fantasy, another delusion, another example of Marcus reaching beyond his grasp. I had no idea that by then, it would be too late. That my family's inability to see who I really was would lead to consequences none of us saw coming. That their determination to save me from myself would nearly destroy everything I'd worked to build. The next morning, I gave my notice at Murphy's restaurant. Then I called Morrison Construction and told them I wouldn't be coming in. By noon, I'd submitted my formal resignation letter, cleaned out my locker, and said goodbye to the coworkers who'd known me as just another guy trying to make an honest living. For the first time in over a year, I was free to be exactly who I was. Marcus Chen, CEO of a $45 million company, architect of a software platform that was transforming how small businesses operated across the country, entrepreneur, on the verge of something incredible. Too bad the people who mattered most had no idea any of it was real. The signature felt heavier than it should have. $10.2 million transferred into the Marcus Chen Solutions business account with a simple swipe of black ink across cream-colored paper. Jonathan Hartwell smiled as he collected the documents, sliding them into a leather portfolio that probably cost more than most people made in a month. "Welcome to the Pinnacle Ventures family, Marcus," he said, extending his hand across the conference table. "We're looking forward to watching you scale this thing into something extraordinary."
Extraordinary.
The word echoed in my head as I walked back to my car in the parking garage beneath the Pinnacle Denver office. 3 weeks ago, I'd been mixing concrete and carrying lumber. Today, I was the CEO of a company valued at nearly $50 million, with enough funding to hire a real team, expand into new markets, and transform my late-night coding sessions into a legitimate tech empire. The drive home should have been triumphant. Instead, it felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold through a television screen. I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting to see a message from Jonathan telling me there had been some mistake, that they'd mixed up my file with someone who actually deserved this kind of opportunity. But the money was real. The contracts were signed. The future I'd been building in secret was finally officially, undeniably legitimate. I pulled into my mother's driveway just after 6 in the evening. The house looked exactly the same as it had that morning when I'd left for the most important meeting of my life. Same yellow siding, same crooked mailbox, same garden gnome that Jessica had bought as a joke 3 Christmases ago, and that Mom had never had the heart to remove. The normalcy felt jarring. How could everything look so ordinary when my entire world had just shifted beneath my feet? Inside, the usual evening routine was unfolding. Mom was in the kitchen stirring something that smelled like her famous beef stew. The television was on in the living room, tuned to the local news. David's voice carried from the back porch where he was probably grilling something for dinner with his family. Jessica's laugh floated down from her apartment above the garage. They had no idea. None of them had any clue that the person they thought they knew, the reformed dreamer who'd finally accepted his limitations, had just become one of the youngest tech CEOs in Colorado. "How was work, honey?" Mom called from the kitchen without looking up from the stove. "Work?" I almost laughed at the irony. "It was good," I said, hanging my jacket on the hook by the front door. "Really good, actually." "That's nice, dear. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Will you tell David to come in and wash up?" I walked through the house in a daze, past the family photos that documented decades of birthdays and graduations and holidays, past the living room where I'd spent countless evenings pretending to watch television while actually responding to customer emails, past the kitchen table where I'd eaten breakfast this morning, as just another member of the Chen family struggling to make ends meet. David was flipping burgers on the back porch, a beer in his free hand and grass stains on his work clothes. His twin boys Tommy and Jake were running around the yard with water guns, their voices high and excited as they chased each other between the lawn furniture. "Hey there, corporate climber," he said when he saw me, grinning at his own joke. "How were things at the construction site today? Build anything impressive?" Corporate climber, if he only knew how accurate that description had become. "Actually, I need to tell you something," I started, then stopped. The words felt too big for this ordinary moment, too significant for a conversation that was supposed to be about hamburgers and homework and weekend plans. David raised an eyebrow. "Sounds serious. You finally asked Sarah to move in with you?" Sarah? I'd barely thought about her all day, too consumed with contracts and funding rounds and the future I was about to step into. We'd been dating for 8 months, and she'd been dropping increasingly obvious hints about taking things to the next level. She pictured us in a small house somewhere in the suburbs, maybe starting a family in a few years, living the kind of stable, predictable life that people like us were supposed to want. The problem was, I wasn't people like us anymore. I wasn't sure I ever had been. "No, it's not about Sarah," I said. "It's about work, about what I've been doing." Before David could respond, Mom's voice called from the kitchen, "Boys, dinner." The moment dissolved. David turned off the grill and herded his sons toward the back door, still chattering about water guns and summer vacation plans. I followed them inside, the weight of my secret feeling heavier with each step. Dinner was the same as always. Mom had made enough food for a small army, despite the fact that it was just the 3 adults and 2 kids around the table. She asked David about his day supervising the Morrison construction crew. She asked Jessica about her latest graphic design project. She asked me about the weather, about traffic, about anything except the question that would have revealed the truth about who I'd become. Jessica was scrolling through her phone between bites, occasionally showing us memes or social media posts that she found amusing. "Oh, this is interesting," she said, holding up her screen. "There was some big tech investment announcement today. Some Denver company got like $10 million from venture capitalists. Can you imagine? $10 million for a startup nobody's ever heard of." My heart stopped. The food in my mouth suddenly tasted like cardboard. "What company?" David asked, only mildly interested. Jessica squinted at her phone. "Marcus Chen Solutions." Weird, right? Same name as our Marcus, but obviously not the same person. This guy is supposedly some kind of software genius, built something that helps small businesses manage their customers better. Mom laughed. "Well, our Marcus is certainly smart enough to build something like that. Remember how he used to spend hours on that old computer when he was in high school, always coding something or other?" "Yeah, but that was just playing around," David said. "This is serious business. The article says the company is worth almost $50 million. Can you imagine what you could do with that kind of money?" I sat frozen, listening to my family discuss my life like it was happening to a stranger. They were reading about my achievement, talking about my success, marveling at the opportunity I'd just secured, and they had no idea it was me. The disconnect was so profound it made me dizzy. "Marcus, you're being awfully quiet," Mom observed. "Everything okay?" I looked around the table at the three people who knew me better than anyone else in the world, the people who'd watched me grow up and fail and pick myself back up again, the people who were supposed to understand me even when I didn't understand myself. They were staring at me with expressions of mild concern, waiting for me to explain why I seemed distracted during what was supposed to be just another ordinary family dinner. This was my chance. I could tell them everything right now. I could explain about the late nights and the secret coding sessions and the coffee shop meetings and the investor calls. I could show them the signed contracts in my briefcase, the bank statements that proved everything Jessica had just read about was real, the business cards that identified me as the CEO of Marcus Chen. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way David had dismissed my high school programming as just playing around. Maybe it was the certainty in Jessica's voice when she said it was obviously not the same person. Maybe it was the memory of all the times I'd tried to share my dreams with them, only to be met with gentle condescension and practical advice about accepting reality. Or maybe it was the fear that even now, even with $10 million in funding and a company worth $50 million, they still wouldn't believe me, that they'd find some way to minimize what I'd accomplished, to explain it away as luck or timing, or anything except the result of years of hard work and dedication they'd never bothered to see. "I'm fine," I said finally, "just tired, long day." The conversation moved on to other topics, weekend plans, television shows, neighborhood gossip. I nodded and smiled and made appropriate responses while my mind raced with everything I wasn't saying. The secret felt like a physical weight in my chest, pressing against my lungs and making it hard to breathe normally. After dinner, I retreated to my room and pulled out my laptop. The business bank account showed a balance that still didn't feel real, $10,247,000, $10,247,000, more money than everyone in my family had ever earned combined, sitting in an account they didn't even know existed. My email inbox was flooded with messages, customer inquiries from businesses around the world who'd heard about the Pinnacle investment and wanted to learn more about my software. Interview requests from technology magazines and business publications, speaking invitations from conferences and industry events, messages from other entrepreneurs asking for advice, from job seekers wanting to work for my company, from competitors trying to understand how I'd built something so successful so quickly. Each message was a reminder of how dramatically my life had changed in the span of a single day. This morning, I'd been Marcus Chen, the construction worker, living in his childhood bedroom and pretending his dreams didn't matter. Tonight I was Marcus Chen, the CEO, fielding inquiries from Fortune 500 companies and planning expansion strategies that would affect thousands of employees and millions of customers. But to the people downstairs watching television and planning their ordinary tomorrows, I was still just Marcus, the disappointment, the dreamer who'd finally learned to settle for less. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. I started drafting an email to my mother, trying to find words that could bridge the gap between who they thought I was and who I'd actually become. "Dear Mom," I wrote, then deleted it. "I have something important to tell you all." I tried, then deleted that too. "You might have seen in the news today," I began, then stopped and closed the laptop altogether. "How do you tell your family that everything they think they know about you is wrong? How do you explain that you've been living a double life for over a year, that the person they've been worried about and pitying and trying to help has actually been building an empire right under their noses?" The phone rang, interrupting my spiral of anxiety. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "Hey," she said when I answered, her voice warm and familiar. "I tried calling earlier, but it went straight to voicemail. How was your day?" "It was eventful," I said, which was perhaps the greatest understatement of my life. "Oh, that reminds me. I saw the weirdest thing on social media today. There's some tech company with the exact same name as you that just got a huge investment. Marcus Chen Solutions. Isn't that funny? What are the odds?" The same sinking feeling returned to my stomach. Even Sarah, who'd been dating me for 8 months and knew me better than almost anyone, couldn't conceive of the possibility that the Marcus Chen in the news might actually be me. "Yeah," I said weakly, That's quite a coincidence, I know, right? Although I guess Chen is a pretty common name, still it made me think of you and all those computer projects you used to work on. Remember when we first met and you were always staying up late typing on your laptop?
I used to wonder what you were building. She'd wondered, but she'd never asked. None of them had ever asked. Not really. They'd all just assumed that whatever I was doing couldn't be that important, couldn't be that valuable, couldn't be anything more than a hobby to keep me occupied while I figured out my real life. Sarah, I said, the words coming out before I could stop them, what if I told you that company actually was mine, that I've been building it this whole time? She laughed, the sound light and affectionate. Oh Marcus, you and your imagination, that would be amazing, wouldn't it? But I love you just the way you are. You don't need to be some big-shot CEO to impress me. I fell for the guy who works hard at an honest job and treats his family well, not some fantasy version of yourself. The guy who works hard at an honest job, the fantasy version of myself. She just summarized perfectly how my entire family saw me. The real Marcus was the construction worker and anything else was delusion. Right, I said. Of course. We talked for another few minutes about her day at the hospital, about weekend plans, about a movie she wanted to see. Normal, everyday conversation between two people who were supposed to know each other well, but every word felt like it was creating more distance between us, widening the gap between who she thought I was and who I'd actually become. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of a life I was rapidly outgrowing. The superhero posters that had inspired dreams of doing something important with my life. The participation trophies that represented a childhood where trying hard was enough, where potential mattered more than results. The desk where I'd spent countless hours learning to code, building the foundation for everything that was happening now. Tomorrow, I'd need to start the real work of building Marcus Chen Solutions into the company Pinnacle Ventures expected it to become. I'd need to hire employees, expand the office space, develop new features, penetrate new markets. I'd need to become the kind of leader who could justify their $10 million investment and deliver the growth they were counting on. But tonight, I was still just Marcus the construction worker, lying in his childhood bed and wondering how long he could keep pretending to be someone he wasn't. The next morning brought a harsh awakening in the form of my phone buzzing at 5:30 with calls from reporters. The TechCrunch article had been picked up by other publications overnight, and suddenly everyone wanted to know more about the mysterious young CEO who'd seemingly appeared out of nowhere to land one of the biggest funding rounds in Colorado tech history. I stepped outside to take the calls, pacing around the backyard while I tried to sound professional and confident to journalists who assumed I was speaking from a corner office somewhere instead of from my mother's garden. Mr. Chen, this is Patricia Williams from Forbes. I'm working on a piece about emerging entrepreneurs in secondary tech markets. Do you have time for a quick interview about your background and how you built Marcus Chen Solutions? Forbes. They wanted to write about me in Forbes. I'd be happy to speak with you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Though I should mention I'm traveling today, so it would need to be a phone interview. Of course, our readers are particularly interested in your story because you seem to have built a significant business without any of the traditional Silicon Valley connections or venture capital relationships. How did you fund the early development of your software? I spent 20 minutes explaining my bootstrap approach, my years of reinvesting every dollar of revenue back into development and infrastructure, my strategy of growing organically through customer referrals and word-of-mouth marketing. It was a good story, the kind of entrepreneur against all odds narrative that business publications love to feature. What I didn't mention was that I'd been living in my childhood bedroom while building this empire, that my family thought I mixed concrete for a living, that the home office I kept referencing was actually a series of 24-hour coffee shops around Denver. By the time I finished the Forbes interview, I'd missed 3 calls from other reporters, 2 from potential customers, and 1 from Kevin, my employee, who was probably wondering why his boss wasn't in the office yet. I was walking back toward the house when David's truck pulled into the driveway. He climbed out wearing his Morrison construction uniform and carrying a thermos of coffee that was probably his third of the morning. "You're up early," he said, noting my professional clothes. "Job interview." The question hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, fresh off a Forbes interview, fielding calls from investors and customers around the world, running a company that employed people and served thousands of businesses, and my own brother still thought I was looking for work. Something like that, I said, which was becoming my standard non-answer for questions I couldn't figure out how to address honestly.
David studied my face with the kind of concern that older brothers specialize in. You know, Marcus, I've been thinking, you've been acting strange lately. Staying out late, getting dressed up for mysterious appointments, taking phone calls in the backyard. Mom's starting to worry. Worry about what? About whether you're getting yourself into some kind of trouble. You know how she is. She sees you acting secretive, and her imagination starts running wild. She's convinced you're either gambling or involved with some questionable people, or... He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with whatever else Mom had imagined. The irony was devastating. My family was so certain I was incapable of legitimate success, that when I started acting like a successful person, their first assumption was that I must be doing something illegal or irresponsible. David, I said carefully, what if I told you I was actually doing really well? That the mysterious appointments and phone calls were related to something good, something I've been working toward for a long time. He smiled the kind of patient, indulgent smile you'd give to a child who claimed to have seen a unicorn. Marcus, I know you want to believe you're on the verge of some big breakthrough. We all have dreams, but you've got to be realistic about your situation. You're 25 years old with no college degree, no professional experience outside of manual labor, and no connections in whatever industry you think you're going to conquer. No college degree. That stung, even though it was technically true. I'd never finished community college, because I'd been too busy building the software that was now worth $50 million. But David didn't know that. To him, the lack of a diploma was just another limitation I needed to accept. What if I told you I don't need connections? I pressed. What if I told you I'd already built something valuable, something that people want to pay for? Then I'd say I'm proud of you for staying positive, but I'd also say you need to be careful about getting your hopes up too high. Remember what happened last time you thought you were going to conquer the business world. You came home broke and defeated, and it took you months to recover from that disappointment. Last time. He was referring to my failed attempt to raise money in Denver 2 years ago, when I'd been young and naive and unprepared for the harsh realities of startup fundraising. He saw that failure as proof that I wasn't cut out for entrepreneurship, evidence that I needed to stick to more realistic goals. He had no idea that the failure he was referencing had actually been a learning experience that taught me everything I needed to know about building a sustainable business without external funding. That the rejection and disappointment had forced me to develop the discipline and patience required to bootstrap my way to success. I should get going, I said, ending the conversation before it could get more painful. Don't want to be late. Good luck with whatever it is, David called after me as I walked toward my car. Just remember, there's no shame in honest work. Construction might not be glamorous, but it's steady, and steady is what matters in the long run. Steady is what matters in the long run. The words echoed in my head as I drove toward my office, past the construction sites where David spent his days, past the restaurant where I'd waited tables just weeks ago, past the coffee shops where I'd built the foundation of my current success. My family's definition of success was so narrow, so limited by their own experiences and expectations, that they couldn't see beyond it even when the evidence was right in front of them. They'd rather believe I was involved in something questionable than accept the possibility that I'd achieved something extraordinary. The office was buzzing with activity when I arrived. Kevin had set up his workstation in the back corner and was already deep into debugging a customer integration issue. The phone was ringing constantly with inquiries from potential clients who'd heard about the Pinnacle funding. The email inbox was overflowing with interview requests, partnership proposals, and job applications from developers who wanted to be part of what we were building. This is insane, Kevin said when he saw me. I've been here for 2 hours and haven't had a chance to touch the keyboard. Everyone wants to know about Marcus Chen Solutions all of a sudden. What happened? We got some publicity, I said, which was perhaps the understatement of the decade. I spent the morning triaging the chaos, prioritizing the most important customer inquiries and scheduling interviews with the most promising job candidates. By lunchtime, we'd received applications from over 200 developers, designers, and business professionals who wanted to join our team. The phone hadn't stopped ringing since I'd arrived. It was exhilarating and overwhelming at the same time. 3 days ago, Marcus Chen Solutions had been a one-man operation running on caffeine and determination. Today, it was a legitimate company with serious growth potential and the resources to achieve it. But the success felt hollow without anyone to share it with. I was experiencing the biggest breakthrough of my life in complete isolation, unable to tell the people who mattered most because they'd never believe it was real. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to tell them, all of them. Mom, David, Jessica, Sarah. I was going to sit them down and explain everything, show them the contracts and bank statements and news articles, prove beyond any doubt that their assumptions about me had been wrong. I drove home early, rehearsing what I'd say, imagining their reactions when they realized the truth. Would they be proud, shocked, embarrassed about the way they'd been treating me? Would David finally see me as an equal, instead of a little brother who needed protection from his own ambitions? The house was quiet when I arrived. Mom was in her garden, tending to the roses she'd been nurturing for decades. Jessica's car was in the driveway, so she was probably upstairs working on one of her design projects. David wouldn't be home for another hour, but I could wait. I found Mom kneeling among the flower beds, wearing the same gardening gloves she'd had since I was in middle school. She looked up when she heard my footsteps on the gravel path. "You're home early," she observed. "Everything okay at work?" "Actually, Mom, I need to talk to you about something important, about work, about what I've really been doing." She sat back on her heels, giving me her full attention. "You sound serious. Is everything all right?" "Everything is more than all right. It's incredible. But I need to explain something I should have told you months ago." I was about to continue when Jessica appeared at the back door, her phone pressed to her ear and her face twisted with concern. "Mom, you need to see this," she called out. "Turn on the news. Channel 7. We followed her inside, Mom still wearing her gardening gloves, and me still carrying the weight of my unspoken confession. Jessica grabbed the remote and flipped to the local news station where a perfectly coiffed anchor was reading from a teleprompter with an expression of professional concern. "A troubling story out of Denver this afternoon where local authorities are investigating what appears to be an elaborate fraud scheme involving a fake technology company and stolen investor funds. The business, which goes by the name Marcus Chen Solutions, allegedly convinced a prominent venture capital firm to invest over $10 million in software that may not actually exist." The blood drained from my face, my vision went dark around the edges. The reporter's voice seemed to be coming from very far away. According to sources close to the investigation, the so-called CEO Marcus Chen appears to be a construction worker with no technology background who may have used sophisticated identity theft techniques to create fake business documents and customer testimonials. Pinnacle Ventures, the investment firm involved, has declined to comment, but sources indicate they are cooperating fully with law enforcement. Jessica turned to stare at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and horror. "Marcus," she whispered, "this can't be a coincidence. Your name, the same company name." Mom was looking back and forth between the television and my face, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that looked like fear. "Oh no," she breathed. "Oh Marcus, what have you done?" The next few minutes passed in a blur of accusations, denials, and increasingly frantic explanations that no one seemed to believe. Jessica kept repeating that she'd known something was wrong, that my secretive behavior and mysterious appointments had been red flags she should have recognized sooner. Mom sat down heavily at the kitchen table, her face pale with shock and disappointment. "I need to call David," she said, reaching for her phone with shaking hands. "He needs to know about this before the police show up." "Mom, wait," I said desperately. "You don't understand, this is all wrong. The company is real, the software is real, I built it myself over the past 2 years. The investment is legitimate. Someone is spreading false information, but I can prove." "Marcus, stop." Mom's voice was sharper than I'd ever heard it. "Just stop. No more lies, no more stories. We need to figure out how to handle this before it gets worse." Lies, stories. She thought I was a criminal, a fraud, a pathetic dreamer who'd finally crossed the line from fantasy into illegality. The woman who'd raised me, who'd claimed to believe in me even when no one else would, was looking at me like I was a stranger. David arrived 20 minutes later, still in his work clothes and moving with the grim determination of someone who'd been called to handle a family crisis. By then the news story had been picked up by other local stations, each adding new details about the elaborate fraud scheme and the fake technology company that had somehow convinced sophisticated investors to hand over millions of dollars. "Tell me this isn't true," David said without preamble as soon as he walked through the door. "Tell me you didn't get yourself involved in some kind of scam." "It's not a scam," I said, my voice hoarse from an hour of failed explanations. "Everything you're hearing on the news is wrong. Marcus Chen Solutions is my company. I built it. The investment is real, the software is real, I can show you the contracts, the bank statements, the customer testimonials, Marcus. David's voice was patient but firm, the tone you'd use with someone who was clearly delusional. You work construction, you live in mom's house, you drive a 10-year-old Honda and eat cereal for dinner half the time because you can't afford groceries. You're not the CEO of a multi-million-dollar technology company. The statement hung in the air like a physical presence. You're not the CEO of a multi-million-dollar technology company, said with such absolute certainty, such complete dismissal of any possibility that their assumptions about me might be wrong. But I am, I said quietly. I know how it sounds, I know it seems impossible, but I am. I've been building this for 2 years, working nights, weekends, every spare moment I had. The construction job was just to pay the bills while I developed the software. The investment from Pinnacle Ventures is real, the contracts are signed, the money is in the bank. Jessica pulled out her phone and started scrolling through social media. The story is everywhere now, she said. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. People are calling it one of the biggest fraud cases in Colorado history. They're saying you might be looking at federal charges for wire fraud and identity theft. Federal charges, wire fraud, identity theft. Each phrase felt like a physical blow, driving home the impossible situation I found myself in. Somehow, in the space of a few hours, I'd gone from successful entrepreneur to suspected criminal, from family disappointment to family shame. I need to make some calls, I said, pulling out my phone. I need to contact Jonathan Hartwell, my lawyer, maybe get a statement from Kevin who works with me. I can clear this up, but I need to. Marcus, put the phone down. Mom's voice was gentle but unyielding. We're not making any calls until we talk to a criminal defense attorney. Whatever you've gotten yourself into, we need professional help to get you out of it. A criminal defense attorney. She was already planning my legal defense against charges I hadn't committed, crimes I'd never contemplated, fraud allegations that made no sense to anyone who knew the truth about what I'd built. The truth, that was the core of the problem. The truth was so far outside their expectations, so inconsistent with their understanding of who I was and what I was capable of, that they couldn't accept it even when I presented it directly. It was easier for them to believe I was a criminal than to believe I was successful. I'm going to my room, I said, the weight of the day finally crushing down on me. I need to think. Marcus, David called as I headed for the stairs. We're going to figure this out, okay? We're going to get you the help you need. But you have to stop with the stories. The fantasy has gone too far, and now people are going to get hurt if we don't face reality. Reality. Their reality was so limited, so constrained by their own experiences and assumptions that my actual reality looked like delusion. The success I'd worked years to achieve, the breakthrough that should have been the proudest moment of my life, had become evidence of my mental instability in their eyes. I climbed the stairs to my childhood bedroom, past the family photos that documented a lifetime of shared experiences and mutual understanding that apparently meant nothing when confronted with something outside their narrow definition of possible. I closed the door behind me and sat down on the bed, surrounded by the artifacts of the person they thought I'd always be. My phone was buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, customers, potential employees, and law enforcement officials trying to make sense of the conflicting information that was circulating about Marcus Chen Solutions. Each call was a reminder of how dramatically my life had changed in the span of a single day, how quickly success could transform into scandal when viewed through the wrong lens. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I opened my laptop and stared at the screen, trying to figure out how to prove my innocence to people who'd already decided I was guilty, how to demonstrate my success to a family who'd rather believe I was delusional than accept that they'd been wrong about me all along. Outside my window, I could hear David and Jessica talking in urgent, worried tones about lawyers and damage control and how to protect the family from the fallout of my alleged crimes. Mom was on the phone with someone, probably her sister, explaining in hushed tones about the trouble I'd gotten myself into and asking for prayers or advice, or maybe just sympathy for having raised a son who'd turned out so wrong. They were trying to help in their way, trying to save me from consequences they were certain I deserved, trying to minimize the damage from choices they were convinced I'd made. But their help felt like abandonment, their protection felt like betrayal, their concern felt like condemnation. I was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, and my own family thought I was a fraud. Tomorrow, I'd have to start the process of proving them wrong. I'd have to provide documentation, bring in witnesses, maybe even submit to police interviews or legal depositions. I'd have to demonstrate, point by point, that every assumption they'd made about me was incorrect. But tonight I was just Marcus the disappointment again, sitting in his childhood bedroom and wondering how the biggest success of his life had become the source of his family's greatest shame. The knock on my door came at 7 in the morning, 3 sharp raps that cut through the silence like gunshots. I'd been awake all night, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how to salvage what was left of my life from the wreckage of yesterday's news reports. "Marcus, there's someone here to see you." Mom's voice was tight with anxiety. I dragged myself downstairs, expecting to find a police officer or maybe a reporter looking for a statement. Instead, I found Jonathan Hartwell standing in our living room, looking completely out of place in his expensive suit among Mom's collection of ceramic angels and family photographs. "We need to talk," he said simply. Mom hovered nearby, clearly torn between protecting me and wanting to hear what this official-looking stranger had to say about her son's alleged crimes. David had arrived early for work and was standing in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed and expression grim. "The news reports are complete fabrication," Jonathan continued, pulling out his phone and showing us a screenshot. "Someone created fake social media accounts, false news articles and fraudulent police statements. They've been systematically spreading disinformation about your company for the past 18 hours. The words hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean fake?" "I mean someone went to extraordinary lengths to destroy your reputation and credibility. They created convincing-looking news websites, fake social media profiles for supposed law enforcement officials, even doctored screenshots of arrest warrants. It's sophisticated psychological warfare designed to discredit you and your business." Mom sank into her favorite armchair, her face pale. "But why would someone do that?" Jonathan's expression darkened. "Because Marcus Chen Solutions is worth $50 million, and there are people who'd rather see it destroyed than allow Marcus to succeed." The silence that followed was deafening. David's arms slowly uncrossed. Jessica appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by voices she'd been trying not to overhear. Mom stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "50 million, she whispered. "The investment is completely legitimate," Jonathan continued. "Marcus built one of the most innovative customer management platforms in the industry. Our due diligence was exhaustive. The company is real, the software is revolutionary, and the growth projections are conservative if anything." David stepped into the living room, moving like someone in a dream. "You're saying Marcus actually is the CEO of this company, has been for 2 years. We've been tracking his progress since the TechCrunch article mentioned his platform. What he's accomplished without traditional funding or Silicon Valley connections is remarkable." I watched my family's faces as the truth settled over them like fog. Confusion gave way to comprehension, comprehension gave way to shock, and shock gave way to something that looked dangerously close to shame. "The fake news campaign appears to be the work of a competitor," Jonathan explained. "TechFlow Solutions has been trying to develop similar software for 3 years without success. When they realized Marcus had beaten them to market and secured major funding, they decided to try destroying his reputation instead of competing legitimately." "But how did you figure out it was fake?" Jessica asked, her voice barely audible. "Because I was in the room when Marcus signed the contracts, because I've seen his office, met his employees and reviewed 18 months of financial records, because I've spent my career evaluating businesses, and Marcus Chen Solutions is one of the most impressive startups I've encountered." Mom was staring at me with tears in her eyes. "You really built a company worth $50 million, I nodded, not trusting my voice. "And we," David started, then stopped. "We thought you were a fraud. You thought I was incapable of success," I corrected gently. "There's a difference." Jonathan looked around the room, taking in the family dynamic he'd walked into. "I'll leave you to process this privately. Marcus, we need to discuss next steps for managing the media fallout, but that can wait until tomorrow." After he left, we sat in silence for a long time. The television was still on, now showing a retraction segment where the same anchor who'd called me a fraud 12 hours earlier was explaining how the station had been deceived by sophisticated fake news sources. "I'm sorry," Mom said finally. "I'm so sorry, Marcus." "We all are," David added. "We should have believed you." "Should you have?" I asked. "When have I ever given you reason to think I was capable of something like this?" The question hung in the air because we all knew the answer. I'd spent years being the family disappointment, the dreamer who couldn't make his dreams reality, the brother who needed protection from his own ambitions. Their assumptions about me weren't malicious or irrational. They were based on a lifetime of evidence that I was exactly who they thought I was. But I tried to tell you, I continued. Yesterday morning, when I said I was doing well, when I asked what you'd think if I told you I'd built something valuable, you couldn't even consider the possibility. David winced. You have to understand, from our perspective, from your perspective, I was delusional. I know. The question is what that says about how you see me. Jessica came downstairs and perched on the edge of the couch. You could have just shown us the bank statements or the contracts or something, proved it instead of talking in riddles. Would you have believed them, or would you have assumed they were fake, just like you assumed the news reports were real? She didn't answer because we both knew she would have assumed they were fake. The real problem, I said, is that your love for me was conditional on me staying small. As long as I was Marcus the construction worker who needed your help and guidance, you were comfortable. But the moment I became Marcus the successful entrepreneur, I became a stranger. That's not fair, Mom protested. Isn't it? You'd rather believe I was a criminal than believe I was successful. You called a criminal defense attorney before you called Jonathan to verify the investment. You were prepared to defend me against fraud charges, but you weren't prepared to celebrate my achievements. The truth of it settled over the room like a weight. They had been ready to support me through legal troubles, family shame and personal failure, but they hadn't been ready to support my success, because my success changed the fundamental dynamic of our relationships. What happens now? David asked. Now I go back to running my company. The media attention will die down, the fake news sources will be exposed, and Marcus Chen Solutions will continue growing. And us? I looked around at the three people who'd raised me, supported me, and ultimately failed to see me for who I really was. I don't know. That depends on whether you can accept that the person you thought you were protecting never actually existed. Over the next few weeks the story unfolded exactly as Jonathan had predicted. TechFlow Solutions was exposed as the source of the disinformation campaign. Their CEO resigned in disgrace. The fake news websites were shut down. The real media picked up the story of the sophisticated sabotage attempt, turning me from suspected fraud into sympathetic victim overnight. But the damage to my family relationships proved more lasting than the damage to my business reputation. Sarah broke up with me 3 days after the truth came out. I fell in love with someone who needed me, she explained. I don't know who you are now. David struggled to treat me as an equal instead of a little brother who needed guidance. Our conversations became stilted, formal, like we were acquaintances trying to be polite rather than siblings who'd grown up together. Jessica handled it better, throwing herself into learning about my business and asking thoughtful questions about software development and customer management, but even she seemed uncomfortable with the shift in family dynamics. Mom tried the hardest to adjust, asking about my work and expressing pride in my accomplishments, but I could see the confusion in her eyes when she looked at me, like she was trying to reconcile the son she'd raised with the successful entrepreneur sitting at her kitchen table. The final conversation happened on a Sunday evening in November, 6 months after the truth had come out. We were sitting around the dinner table making small talk about weather and weekend plans, when Mom finally asked the question that had been hanging over us for months. Do you forgive us? I set down my fork and considered the question. For not believing in me, yes. For not supporting my dreams, yes. For assuming the worst when you should have assumed the best, yes. I forgive you for all of that. But I can't forget that when you had to choose between believing I was successful and believing I was a criminal, you chose criminal. That tells me something about how you see me that forgiveness can't change. David shifted uncomfortably. We were trying to protect you. You were trying to protect yourselves from the embarrassment of having believed in me if I failed again, from the discomfort of realizing you'd been wrong about who I am and what I'm capable of. So what are you saying? Mom asked, tears in her eyes. I'm saying I love you, but I can't be your Marcus anymore. The Marcus you loved was small, manageable, someone whose problems you could solve and whose failures you could cushion, but I'm not that person. I never was. I stood up from the table looking around at the three faces that had defined my understanding of family for 25 years. I'm moving to San Francisco next month. Pinnacle wants to open a West Coast office and it makes sense for me to be there. But this is your home, Jessica protested. No, it's the place where I pretended to be someone I wasn't for so long that even the people who loved me couldn't see who I really was. I walked to the front door, pausing to look back at the living room where I'd spent countless evenings hiding my real work behind television shows and casual conversation, where I'd built an empire while everyone assumed I was wasting time on meaningless projects. "Marcus," Mom called after me. "Will we see you again?" "Of course, you're my family, but you'll be seeing the real me from now on, not the version you were more comfortable with." 3 months later, I was standing in my corner office on the 42nd floor of a downtown San Francisco high-rise, looking out at the bay and thinking about the journey that had brought me here. Marcus Chen Solutions now employed 68 people and served over 50,000 businesses worldwide. We just closed a Series B funding round that valued the company at $200 million. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica, a photo of her wearing a Marcus Chen Solutions t-shirt she'd ordered online, with a message that read, "Wearing this to remind myself to believe in impossible things." I smiled and set the phone aside, then turned back to the computer screen where I was reviewing applications for our next round of hiring. We had ambitious plans for the coming year: new markets to penetrate, new features to develop, new ways to help small businesses succeed in an increasingly complex world. Outside my office, Kevin was leading a team meeting about our expansion into international markets. The woman I'd hired as head of marketing was on a call with Forbes, discussing a cover story about young entrepreneurs who were changing the business landscape. The VP of engineering I'd recruited from Google was presenting our technical roadmap to a room full of developers who'd left prestigious companies to join our mission. These people believed in what we were building. They saw the value in what I'd created. They didn't need me to be smaller or more manageable in order to support my success. My family had loved me, but they'd loved a fiction. They'd supported me, but only as long as I remained someone who needed their support. They'd believed in me, but only in my potential for ordinary achievements that fit their understanding of what success looked like. The real Marcus Chen, the one who could build multi-million-dollar companies and revolutionary software platforms, had been invisible to them even when he was sitting right at their dinner table. But that was okay, because the world was full of people who could see extraordinary achievements when they encountered them, who could recognize success even when it came from unexpected sources, who could believe in impossible things when the evidence demanded it. I didn't need my family to validate my accomplishments anymore. I had customers who paid for my software because it transformed their businesses. I had employees who believed in our mission and worked tirelessly to achieve it. I had investors who trusted me with their money because they could see the value I created. And I had the satisfaction of knowing that every assumption they'd made about my limitations had been wrong, that every time they'd encouraged me to be realistic about my prospects, they'd been discouraging me from achieving something remarkable. The Marcus they'd wanted to protect didn't exist anymore. He'd been replaced by someone who didn't need protection, who didn't require guidance, who didn't fit into their comfortable categories of success and failure. Someone who could build impossible things and make them real. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.